It's a privilege to stand here today. It's genuinely a privilege and humbling to stand right here where so many excellent speakers have blessed us the last couple of days. I'll divide my comments into two sections, the people and the progress. Then I'll hand it over to Boaz Johnson, and we'll kind of go down the line. And then I'll finish up. So first of all, some comments about the people who are involved in this project. I've been blessed to participate in hundreds of hours of conversation with a team of gifted Bible scholars. 3 plus myself are here today, and you'll hear from each of them. 3 of our Old Testament translators are not here today, and Boaz will give their names and comment on them. 2 of our New Testament translators are also not here today, so I will comment on them briefly right now. First, Karen Reeder. Karen is one of our New Testament translation team members. She teaches at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. She holds a master's degree from Wheaton College, a second master's from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD from the University of Cambridge in the UK. You may know of her from her 2022 IVP academic book, The Samaritan Woman's Story, which sold out within the last hour or so at the IVP. So somebody got however many they brought, they've all been sold. But it's an excellent book, The Samaritan Woman's Story. Another member of our New Testament team who is not here is Alice Yaffe Day. And she teaches at Azusa Pacific University in Southern California. She holds master's degrees from Yale. That's a typo, sorry. And a PhD from Princeton. Many of her publications bring an African and even Cameroonian perspective to important issues of biblical interpretation and church life. Alice is fluent in English and French. She's a scholar of Latin, Classical Greek, and the biblical languages, and translation comes very naturally to her. So those are some comments about the people, and you'll hear more and see more as we fill this hour. And now the progress that we've made, some comments about that. Our current work focuses on about 500 verses of the Bible. Not exactly 500, but in that range. They come from across the canon, from Genesis to 2 John, so almost across the canon, okay? They've been selected because they are often translated to women's detriment. And if that happens, it inevitably leads to misguided interpretation. Though we have finished the translation of all those verses, also important are the translation notes. That's what we're doing now, is writing the translation notes. For example, our translation of 2 John begins in a way that no other Bible that I'm aware of begins. It says, from the elder to the honorable Curia, or Kyria. We present the word Kyria, Kyria, as a woman's name, rather than using one of the common translations, lady or gentlewoman. Moreover, we call her honorable instead of elect or chosen. You may or may not agree with our use of honorable Kyria. In either case, you'll be better able to agree or disagree if you read a paragraph or two explaining why. So I'm explaining to you why we need the translation notes. And at this point, I just want to mention an aspect of our work that most people don't think about. Maybe you do, but most people don't, which is that we sometimes vote. And that's not just our work. Most Bible translations are done by a team, and most translation teams vote when necessary. And now as I typed this out, this occurred to me to say right now because Cindy and Phil are sitting right here. I don't remember whether they wanted to say honorable Kyria. I think I might remember. But you see, that's a place where maybe all 5 of us agreed, maybe 4 of us agreed. That's part of the nature of the work. It's very common that all 5 of the New Testament team members agree. It's very common that all 4 of the Old Testament team members agree. But not always. Opinions differ. So then we either discuss it to consensus or we vote. So that's where we are. We're in the process of explaining our decisions, whether unanimous or vote. And we're well into that process. We're not just beginning that. This process of explaining decisions forces us very naturally to rethink decisions. And in a few places, we make changes. When we come back to it and explain our rationale, we might make changes. One of those, which I'll talk about for a couple minutes here, is Genesis 3:16. Our translation of Genesis 3:16 is not the same as it was when we gave a report like this one 2 years ago in Atlanta. The Old Testament team has revisited that text at great length, I'll add. I'll read it to you in a moment, but first, please understand that the feedback we received wasn't all in the same direction. People asked us to consider making changes, but not necessarily the same changes, hence the revisiting. And as a result, I'm pretty sure that not everyone here will agree. Okay? Not fully, anyway. Nevertheless, it's not secret. It will be published. And so I'll read right now for you Genesis 3:16 from the Old Testament team's work. To the woman, he said, quote, "I will intensify many times over the labor of childbirth, so that it is in anguish that you will give birth to children. You will desire your husband, and he will seek to control you." I'm not using slides, so let me read that again, all right? "I will intensify many times over the labor of childbirth, so that it is in anguish that you will give birth to children. You will desire your husband, and he will seek to control you." One more time, just the last line. "You will desire your husband, and he will seek to control you." The Old Testament team, as I said a minute ago, gave extensive consideration to this verse, a verse that eludes consensus, even among egalitarian scholars. Please know that we do not affirm the innovation found in the ESV, the English Standard Version, revised in 2016 to read, quote, "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband." We don't affirm that. Moreover, we reject the view held by some, including complementarian theologian Wayne Grudem, who, unlike Genesis, understands 3:16 as a curse. He says it is a curse, quote, "God introduced conflict in that Eve would have an inward urging and impulsion to oppose Adam, to resist Adam's leadership." So our translation is not in that direction. Nevertheless, because the text itself doesn't specify the nature of the woman's desire for intimacy, for equality, for children, for all those, for something else, the Old Testament team has opted for a straightforward, somewhat unspecific wording as well. You will desire your husband. So I got us into the Old Testament a little bit there. It's a good transition. Boaz Johnson is on the Old Testament team. I'm going to invite you up to come now And he's going to talk to us about a few of the texts that contain feminine imagery for God.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It has been a joy for me also to be a part of the Old Testament team. We met for hundreds of hours, but it's been, we enjoyed doing that. We enjoyed the dialogue, sometimes in person, sometimes just after a conference like this, sometimes at other places, but mostly online. Um, and we had a lot of debating, a lot of discussions. Um, and at the end of the whole process, we looked at each other and we said, "What? This is going to come to an end now?" And we all wept. We were all so sad that this process is over. And I'm so glad that we were able to then, go through the process of writing notes on our commentary, trying to understand best who said what on each of those verses, and that's what we're going through right now. And I'm so thankful to Jeff for being the moderator of the writing of the notes and stuff like that. You will get a copy of this quite soon, I hope so. Let me introduce you to other members of the team that are not here with me, and I feel so sad. This is the Hebrew Bible. I don't know why they call it Old Testament. It's 2/3 of the Bible, and it's called the Old Testament. Don't ask me why. It's Jesus talked about the Bible all the time. He referred to the Hebrew Bible, and so did Paul, and so that's what we did. Dr. Daiphus Josephu Chamerion is in Kenya. I've always wanted to run with his runners because that's where they come from. I'm a marathon runner, so I want to go there sometime and run with his people at the university, St. Paul's University in Limuru, Kenya, which is just outside of Nairobi. He's the dean of the Faculty of Theology and professor of Old Testament and Translation Studies. I have actually guided a couple of students from his university, PhD students. Spectacular work, amazing women that they are training in Kenya. He's written quite a lot. I won't read through the whole thing here. You will see it at some point. And then Havilya Dharmaraj, he teaches Old Testament at South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies in Bangalore, India. She is a world-renowned Old Testament scholar, has also served on the New International Version team and so amazing people we have. And then I serve on the committee. I teach at North Park University in Chicago. Yeah, North Parkers. That's so great. And then Dr. Uni Lee teaches biblical interpretation and languages at Azusa Pacific University near Los Angeles in California. She's got her BA from Harvard and MA and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. So amazing people that I worked with, and we worked on 173 texts. These texts, I want, some of you were there in my Bushnell lecture yesterday. A lot of these come from Bushnell. We're all the children of Bushnell. She's the one that started this whole process, and the people that formed CBE were all Bushnell disciples, and so that's where these texts come from. A couple of them were added on later on, but that's where it begins. So 173 texts we went through in the Old Testament. And let me give you an idea of some of those texts that we engaged with. We engaged with Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, 26 and 27. Where's that whole idea of who's a woman, right? So we dealt with that situation. Who's a woman? Who's a man? What's the relationship all about? And what does it mean to be made in the image of God? You'll see that in the notes. We engaged with Genesis chapter 2. What does it mean to be an ezer kenegdo, a person who is defined as, with a word that's always used of God, primarily in the Psalms. She is someone that goes ahead of this guy, kenegdo. So we engage with those kinds of things. Genesis 3:16 has already been referred to. We spent a lot of time on Genesis 3 and 16. We engaged with issues in Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 6. Who are these sons of God? Who are these daughters of men? So the whole idea there is that the sons of God were the divine beings in ancient Near Eastern religions that came from Aryan society. And they took advantage of, essentially raped, the common daughters of the common people. That's what the flood narrative is engaging with. So you'll see that in the notes. In Genesis chapter 49, so often there is this phrase that defines God as El Shaddai, God Almighty. Well, where do you get that from? The word Shaddai there is a very maternal image of God. It's a consoling image of God. And the rabbis recognized that, and so did we in our Bible translation work. Do you see the difference there? There is such a lot of difference in how conceptions are made of women. And then, of course, we did Exodus chapter 21, Exodus chapter 38, where and Huldah, for example, the English translations will say, oh, she's a keeper of the wardrobe. The priest will come by and she will say, here is your garment. Here is your garment. I'm so pleased to serve you. Well, the Hebrew word there actually talks about a person of power. She knew the architecture of the temple, and the words also that we engaged with in Exodus and in Leviticus talk about these women who were there. They were like the co-architects with Bezalel, who was the chief architect of the tabernacle. The women who were there were working with him as being the people that knew what this architecture was going to be like. They were scientists, if you will. And the English translation just misses that. So there's a whole lot that we talked about in the Torah. And then we went into the historical books. We talked about Ruth, for example. Ruth, it defines Boaz as being a person of wealth. It's the word chayil in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1. But then when it comes to Ruth, she's just like this, at least in my translation in Hindi, it defines the woman as being this coy, gentle woman who doesn't open her mouth at all. That's not the word that's defined in Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11, and then in Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 10. our notes deal extensively with those kinds of passages. I could go through all the 173 verses, but you'll have to wait for the text to come out. Let me give you one more, and I've talked about this before, and it's worth repeating. Job chapter 2 and verse 9. The English translation says, Job's wife comes to him. Here's this guy who's suffering so much. He's lost his business, he's lost his family, the kids have gone, and he's suffering from this debilitating disease. And she comes to him and she says, what are you doing, man? Holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. We engage with that because the Hebrew word there has nothing to do with cursing. It's barach. It's bless God, and I give you permission to die. Bless God. That's awful, right? That the King James Version has brought it up there, and everyone has slavishly followed the King James Version. So, look forward to this. The person following me is the amazing Cynthia Westfall. Welcome to the podium, madam.
Well, I'm going to cut right to the chase and start talking about our translation. Often the difference between complementarian and egalitarian translation in the New Testament is characterized as boiling down to basically two words. You know those words. Kephale, which is the physical head often, but often metaphorical. And the other one is that crazy word in 1 Timothy 2:12, authenteo. Well, make no mistake. The meaning of these words are quite crucial. And controlling those meanings has been particularly crucial for complementarians. And make a lot of apologetics for it. But the work we have to do isn't just about the meaning of words. It may surprise you, but the careful analysis and interpretation and translation of Greek grammar has had a huge payoff in our translation. Now you're getting ready for the big snooze, right? But it's interesting. It may have had the biggest impact on Ephesians 5:15 through 33. Now you know there's a lot to say about that passage. But I'm going to focus on one phrase that we stand out as significantly different than most English Bibles, if not all English Bibles. And that is verse 33. And it really reconfigures how the passage has been read in English. So the English Standard Version, the ESV, reads, "Each of you, however, should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband." However, our translation is a more straightforward reading of the Greek grammar. Verse 33 concludes the passage on husbands and wives with, "Regardless, as for you, each and every husband must love his wife as himself, so that the wife may respect her husband." Difference. Well, let's talk about why we did that and what it means, because you have to have some confidence in us, don't you, in handling it. In the preceding context, at verse 25, Paul shifts the focus to husbands and explains how they should practice mutual submission. And he keeps that focus on husbands in this conclusion, right up to the conclusion. And he's emphatically direct And he could have simply stated his conclusion with, so, love your wives. That's what he's been saying. Instead, in Greek, there's a threefold repetition of the grammatical subject, which is what I call a pile-on. Woodenly, the Greek says something like, you, every one of you individually, each of you, must love his own wife as himself. So let me illustrate how this works. So, Ashley, would you please stand up for a minute? So listen to this. You, Ashley. My youngest daughter needs to sit down. I could have just said sit down, right? I could have just went, sit down. But I piled on the references, and that places more focus and really more pressure on her, right? Now, and more information as well, right? So that causes, an emphasis, and so an emphatic command. And the command is followed by a dependent clause, not a complete sentence, and it has no formal command in it, or I should say it just has no imperative. That I think would get the point across better. It's called a hina clause. A hina clause is most often a purpose clause, which is very, very common in Greek. And unless there is something really unusual or special in the context, you're going to translate it as a purpose clause, or you're going to interpret it as a result of the primary clause. And in this case, the primary clause is the command to the husband. So it means, and I think you got this, that each husband must love his wife so that, or in order that, the wife might respect her husband. So reciprocity is made explicit here for the husbands. He is to love his wife, and the wife's respect is the desired result or outcome of his love. So other translations tend to turn verse 33 into a double command that equally commands the wife as well as the husband, which is what we see in the ESV translation. Again, each of you, however, should love his wife as himself, and a wife should respect her husband. There's been a great equalization here, right? You don't hear really any emphasis on the husband. It sounds like it's just the same thing. But in reality, in English, it doesn't turn out to be equal. In English, it makes the command to the wife, which isn't there in the Greek, I remind you, the final sentence, which now becomes the focus and the conclusion of the passage, in spite of the fact that the command to the husband is grammatically marked as the conclusion. Let that sink in. And you know what? There's another place most English Bibles put a command to wives where there isn't one in the Greek. Where do you think that is? What is it? No, right here in this passage. Right here. Well, surprise. It's verse 22 where there isn't a command in the Greek. They will say something like, I think you'll remember this one. It says something like, wives, submit to your husbands. But there's no command there. There's no command for wives to submit. In fact, the word submit is not even there in that phrase. Our translation follows the grammar. The command is, be filled with the Spirit in verse 18, followed by a description of the Spirit-filled life given in one humongous sentence. Humongous is a technical term in Greek grammar. So it's singing, starts with speaking, singing, making music, giving thanks, and ending with yielding yourselves to one another out of devotion to Christ. Wives, to your own husband as to the Lord. So 2 things about that. First, Instead of submitting, you'll notice that we use the word yielding, which we think works better with the mutuality in the passage. Second, it makes it clear that the wife's action of yielding carries forward the action of yielding to one another. It's inseparable and should be read as an application or example of yielding. And that constrains, I like the word constrain a lot. I hope you're not, that doesn't bother. Constrains the rest of the passage that follows. That is, all of the rest of the passage is about what being filled with the Spirit looks like. But other translations not only add a command that isn't there in verse 22, or actually there's no command in verse 21 either, mark you. It's a participle. But they override the sentence structure, and they start out not only a new sentence, but a whole new section in verse 22 with subtitles and everything, right? And even though it's right in the middle of a sentence, grammatically, in the Greek. And you know, I think the Greek's inspired and means something that it's in the middle of a sentence. Well, there's a reason. There really is. We all recognize that Paul, that is, all scholars recognize that Paul, and most of you probably, recognize that Paul starts something that scholars call a household code right in the middle of the sentence. And people in the Greco-Roman culture were very familiar with this kind of instruction that broke down obligations in the household into pairs: husbands and wives, parents and children, and masters and slaves. And so many translations are going to say, well, household code, start out, it's a new topic. It's right there. He changed subjects right in the middle of the sentence. And they start the passage with, well, you know it, wives submit to your husbands. And they end the passage about wives and husbands with, the wife should respect her husband. However, now the non-existent commands for wives to submit to and respect their husbands look like the whole focus of the passage. Because now in English, the first sentence sets the topic or the focus of the passage. You know, that's right. You always say, how do you know what the topic of the passage is? Well, what's the first sentence? Look at the first sentence. Well, there's the topic. So the topic of the sentence becomes wife's subjugation, and the conclusion of the passage is wife's subjugation, which is exactly how it was taught to me in church and Bible school. This passage, the whole topic of it is about wife's subjugation. It's clear. But our translation follows the grammar, and it embeds the whole household code under the command, be filled with the Spirit, explaining what it means and what it looks like to be filled with the Spirit and how to mutually submit in these relationships that have a power differential. And actually, isn't that just what you would ask, especially in the hierarchical Roman Empire, when you get a command that says you're supposed to submit to one another, and you're going, I'm a slave owner. It says submit one to another, and I'm sitting next to my slave, and I, go get me a glass of water. And it goes, how am I going to submit to my slave? There's no way I'm going to be able to apply it. And so he automatically breaks down these power relationships and then explains how he gives commands to the dominant and the one with entitlement. That actually explains how mutual submission should look out while it doesn't, tear down the society and sound like you're starting a revolution. The fact is, in the Greek grammar, though, in Ephesians 5, it's a little strange and it's a little weird. Paul manages to avoid giving a command to wives, which is weird. But he does give commands to everyone else in the household, everyone else. In fact, he gives a couple of commands to the husbands and an additional should. Clearly, Paul knows how to write a command. If he wanted to write a command, he would have written a command. But he chooses not to in the case of wives, so why would that be? the main way that this question is answered is just simply translated all as commands because of the context and the culture, right? Oh, let's read this in the culture. It's always a command in the culture, so it should be a command. We'll make it a command. That's a justification, right? And that's the way the other household codes are designed. Women are always commanded. And they are the first ones commanded in the parallel household code in Colossians 3:18. So we're justified in turning it into a command, right? I mean, that's the reasoning. But the other way is to treat it is to consider the use of grammar as inspired and having meaning. That is, Paul deliberately chooses to change the pattern. And it would be an emphatic alteration that both uses the cultural patterns and then subverts them, changes them around. So we still want to answer the question why he would do that. Why would he do it? What is he doing? I mean, and this is a question of interpretation. So the first and most convincing answer is that Paul uses grammar to embed the household code I've already said this really, in being filled by the Spirit and mutual submission or yielding to one another, rather than making the household code understood as part of the cultural hierarchy. So that's great, and that's just, I could go home on that one, right? So this used to be part of the cultural hierarchy in the household codes in the culture. The husbands, the parents, and the masters never even get commanded. And now he grammatically takes this whole thing, puts it into being filled with the Spirit, and then he gives both pairs commands. This is how you mutually submit. You both have obligations in this relationship. And that's enough. But he goes further and he goes further in this passage, and he tells the husband to take on the obligations of a woman and to treat the wife as if she were his male body, right? He says, oh, hey, you're the head, fine and good. Oh, hey, if you're the head, that makes her your body. Well, now who has the genitals, she's the man. And that's actually when it says, so you wash her and you care for her and you feed her. That's women's work. And so this is really bringing out the command to love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul is using the typical role of women in the culture as the model for mutual submission. So by saying submit one to another, for example, let's look at wives, and he doesn't need to give them a command really. Well, and before I say that, let me say that he's already, children enslaved are used as examples for this for the kingdom all over the place, and the fact that he would use wife, for example, of kingdom relationships actually makes a lot of sense. And so he's saying, really, what women, as you were, you know all about submission, you know what the culture tells you about having to submit because of the benefits you received from your husband. So you've been thoroughly trained. I don't have to elaborate. And we're going to assume continuity and build on the culture's understanding of reciprocity in these relationships. Right? She's an example of submission. I mean, how do you mutually submit? Well, how do wives submit? Oh, and then he dramatically reconfigures what husbands' obligations are and what benefits a wife should receive in Christ. That's important. He's reconfiguring the wife's benefits because the culture tells you what the benefits are. So the conclusion in verse 33 says that the main benefit that the wife gives his wife is Christ-like love, and that he should act as if her respect for him is contingent on that love. So here's an allusion to an old Smith Barney commercial for all you seniors in the crowd. You know who you are. Husbands who follow Paul's commands in Ephesians 25 through 33 get respect the old-fashioned way. They earn it. Remember that one? John Houseman? Yeah. And when the wife's submission is described with as to the Lord, it doesn't mean a unilateral obligation of treating her husband as if he is her Lord and Savior. That would be idolatry. Oh, wait a minute, it is idolatry, right? We see it. But that a wife's mutual submission is enacted within the sphere of being in Christ and being filled with the Spirit and the reciprocal Christ-like relationships which are described in the immediate context. Okay. Now, next, I'm going to have my good friend, okay. Next, I'm going to have my good friend Phil Payne come up, and we're so grateful for the warrior that he's been, how he's held that front line for so many years for us.
I'm going to talk about how we translated the passages about slavery. Ephesians 6, 5-9, we translated it this way. You who are enslaved, obey your owners according to human standards, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your hearts, as to Christ, not only while being watched to look good to people, but as slaves of Christ, doing God's will wholeheartedly. Perform the duties of a slave with good will, as if serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward whatever good each one does, whether enslaved or free. And you owners, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both their and your owner is in heaven, and he shows no partiality. Note that we've not used the typical words slaves and masters, but you who are enslaved and owners. Enslaved captures the involuntary nature of slavery. Owners makes it easier to understand that in the Greco-Roman world, women as well as men were slave owners and wielded authority over slaves. Telling slave owners, your and their owner is in heaven and shows no partiality is a subversive wordplay because it reframes and undermines the authority of slave owners and puts the enslaved and their owners at the same level. Our translation makes it clear that slave owners are only owners according to human standards. That is, in God's eyes, no one owns another person. Paul may be building on the sharp contrast he frequently makes between flesh and spirit, in which flesh is strongly denounced. It is slavery that does not align with the spirit and is therefore strongly denounced. Paul makes it clear that he is not advising obedience that runs contrary to God's will and Christ's example. Paul completely reframes the usual Greco-Roman household codes by adding the expressions as to Christ, doing God's will, and as if serving the Lord. In verse 9, Paul reveals the principle that subverts the slave-owner relationship. He says to the owners, do the same to them. Slave owners' treatment of those whom they enslave is therefore also governed by the phrases as in Christ, doing God's will, and serving the Lord. Stop threatening them takes away the key tools slave owners used to control their slaves. We translate Colossians 3:22 to 4:1. You who are enslaved, in all things obey those who are your owners according to human standards, not only when being watched to look good to people, but with sincerity of heart, respecting the Lord. Whatever you do, do it wholeheartedly, as though you were doing it for the Lord, instead of doing it for people, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as your reward. Make the Lord Christ the one you serve. For the one who commits injustice will be paid back for their injustice without partiality. You owners show justice and equality to those you have enslaved, because you know that you yourselves also have an owner in heaven. Our translation identifies the slave's reward as an inheritance from the Lord. This statement is powerful, for in that culture, slaves had no inheritance rights. Our translation of Colossians shows that Paul is commanding slave owners to give their slaves justice and equality. Justice is a legal word that implies that slaves have rights. Equality translates the word isotes. The standard classical Greek dictionary defines isotes, equality. Equality of ratios, proportion, political equality, impartiality. It's derived from isos, which that dictionary defines as equal, or based on equality of rights. Hence we speak of an isosceles triangle, one that has two sides of equal length. It's the clearest word for equality that Paul could have chosen. Many Bibles use fairly, fairness, instead of equality. Our choice, equality, reflects the reality that fairness is usually understood as depending on a particular situation or set of rules. For example, what is considered fair in a college class, on a sports field, or in a court of law differs considerably. So to tell a slave owner to treat enslaved people fairly would surely be understood by the owner in a watered-down way. Equality, however, especially when coupled with justice, cannot be achieved without setting slaves free. But many ask, would Paul actually encourage the freeing of slaves? Paul told slaves in 1 Corinthians 7:21, if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. Paul's letter to Philemon uses all the social pressure and personal influence he can muster to make Philemon receive a runaway slave named Onesimus no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, a dear brother. Mayer is correct to say regarding no longer, we have to leave no longer absolute and not weaken it by mentally supplying no longer only as a slave. The fact that Philemon must receive Onesimus back forever in this new relation excludes slavery, which would be limited, of course, to this life, and stresses that Philemon must receive Onesimus back in the new status of brother. Some, trying to avoid the negation of the status of slave inherent in no longer a slave, have proposed a dichotomy in which slavery as a social status might continue for Onesimus, modified only by the addition of equality in spiritual relations. Paul, however, strips away this dichotomy in the same sense by stating that Onesimus is a beloved brother to Philemon, both in the material and spiritual realms. It is precisely because of the pervasive, unifying influence of Christ that both fleshly and spiritual relations are transformed. Paul commands Philemon, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I will pay it back. Not to mention that you owe me your very self. Paul makes it clear that I would like to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. With this in mind, he concludes, refresh my heart in Christ. Confident of your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even more than I ask. Obedience here naturally refers to Philemon receiving Onesimus back for eternity, no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother. It would trivialize it for him to welcome Onesimus back into slavery or some refreshment to be provided for Paul. Paul makes it clear that he intends Philemon to free Onesimus and accept a new relationship to Onesimus, not as a slave, but as a brother. Paul's confidence that Philemon will do even more is a hint to underwrite Onesimus's return to help Paul in prison. To bring to bear the maximum community pressure, Paul addresses the letter not just to Philemon, but also to Apphia, our sister, to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. He even commands, prepare a guest room for me, because I hope to be restored to you. If Philemon does not emancipate Onesimus, he can look forward to an embarrassing visit. Paul then lists 5 highly respected church leaders who send greetings and so presumably know about this request. The way in which Paul contrasts the status of slavery, no longer a slave, to the status of the beloved brother in the Lord undermines slavery in general. The oneness in Christ, in which there is no slave-free division, had serious practical consequences for Paul, just like the no Jew-Greek division and the no male-female division. To interpret Galatians 3:28 as though it means simply that slaves, like free people, can be slaved, but that their social barriers are unaffected, is to trivialize the social implications of Galatians 3:28 for slaves and free persons in Christ. Slaves who became church leaders exemplify the equal standing of slaves in the church. Within half a century of Paul's writing this letter to Philemon, Ignatius speaks highly of Onesimus, a man of inexpressible love and your bishop in Ephesus. The Muratorian canon identifies Pius I, Bishop of Rome, either as a slave or the brother of the slave Hermas, the author of the Shepherd. Hippolytus says that Calixtus, Bishop of Rome, was an ex-slave. Furthermore, very early church records show Christians purchasing freedom for slaves. All of these factors support our translation of Paul's command to slave owners to treat them with justice and equality. I'll give it back to Jeff.
Thank you, Boaz. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, those of you here in Aurora. Thank you if you're watching online. Thank you to those of you who may watch this in the future on a recording. We appreciate your support and your patience. I have 3 additional comments to wrap up this session. First of all, this is not the only opportunity to get an update on the project. The most recent issue of Mutuality, which Amber held up in her right hand earlier today, is the purple one, has an update. It covers more text, some of the texts that, how do I phrase this? It covers 3 or 4 texts, and not the same ones that we talked about today. All of them have been taken. 50 were brought, they're all gone, but it's online, okay? Secondly, Mutuality Matters podcast has had several episodes that pertain to translation, sometimes about this project and sometimes about the nature of translation in other ways. So that's one comment. I've got 2 more. Secondly, everything that has been said today by the 4 of us is about the current ongoing work, the approximately 500 verses that I mentioned. You will be pleased, I think, to know that more work is being planned. Mimi and I have had extensive conversations about how to move forward, and our plan, without going into details, is to secure a larger number, larger than the 9 who are currently working, a larger number of scholars to translate the Bible book by book. We have just started working on those arrangements. I'm behind on it already. I mean, nothing's been done, and I'm behind on it already. That's not an exaggeration. First, focusing on the books of Ruth, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Philippians, hoping to then turn to Esther, Song of Songs, Ephesians, and Philemon, and then on and on it goes. This work is in the planning stage, so it would be wise for me not to say more about that right now. Finally, yes. Could I mention the Bible translation? Cindy is lamenting the fact that she did not mention an article called Translating Ephesians 5:33, as she was grappling with the time, and which was written by Julie Walsh, who some of you know and has often come to this conference. And it would be embarrassing for me right now if Julie's in the room, but I don't think she came. And she and I partnered on that and wrote an article called Translating Ephesians 5:33. And Julie went the extra step and made it, what's the term, open access. You don't have to get the journal, right? And in our work, we've referred to your work, and then you've kind of cycled that back to us, and I appreciate it. Yeah, it gives like the longer version of why to say so that in that hina clause. Thank you. Finally, I want to explain why the title to this session is called A Familiar Picture. You may or may not have noticed that. That's what it says in the program, A Familiar Picture. During World War II, an Anglican priest named John Bertram Phillips, we now know him as J.B. Phillips, began translating the New Testament for the sake of young people who he noticed struggled to understand older translations of the Bible. He began with Colossians, for reasons I don't know why, and he shared that work with C.S. Lewis. And Lewis, who knew the Bible quite well, wrote back to him and said that reading Colossians in that translation was like seeing a familiar picture after it's been cleaned. So our hope is that our work will also help you to more clearly see these texts that you know so well. And I'll hand it over now to Amber for any announcements she may have. Thank you.